Article 6 obliges states pursue negotiations, and this is not against a complete vacuum. Public international law and treaty law have dealt with negotiation requirements in many different settings. They go back really to the 19th century origins of recognizably modern international law. And when you have agreed to negotiate or to pursue negotiations, you as a country have undertaken to pursue uh, a result, but you've not pledged to actually reach a result. So, in that sense, the Article 6 clause and the clauses like it are sort of, well, dare we say, wishy-washy or more of a wish list. But they do contain a small but real core of obligation. The obligation is you have to pursue negotiations. That part of the provision is not a option. It's not a mere should clause or we would like you to clause. It's a shall clause. States shall pursue negotiations. Um, when we look at how those sorts of clauses have developed across treaties as interpreted by governments unilaterally, but also as interpreted by courts and tribunals. In actually quite a few cases, it's an issue that comes up with some regularity. The obligation goes beyond the simple act of coming to the table and doing something with the partner or partners on the other side of the table. Yes, you have to do that. If you're not sitting at a table negotiating, then you will not have negotiated. That's sort of too obvious to be stated. You've got to pursue negotiations if you are to satisfy a pursue negotiations clause. Now that's pretty open-ended. Negotiation doesn't mean that you chain yourself to the chair and sit there forever and ever talking, nor does it mean you ever reach a concrete result. But you do have to at least endeavor. You have to try to reach a conclusion as to the subject matter that you've agreed to negotiate about, which in the case of Article 6 NPT is pursuing arms control and eventual disarmament. But that's not the full sum of international law on negotiations. If you've pledged to negotiate, it has been said over and over, including in quite recent cases, but going back over 100 years, that you've also, at least implicitly, pledged not to do certain things, and two things in particular you will have pledged not to do. One is to take actions outside the negotiating room that would produce a fait accompli, actions that would end the question by forcing your own preferred answer to the question. You're not allowed to do that if you've committed to negotiate. The second thing you've committed to is not taking steps to aggravate the subject matter of the dispute that you have pledged to negotiate about. They're actually quite closely related. Don't steamroll your negotiating partners by doing things away from the negotiating table that effectively uh, render the negotiations purposeless, and don't do things that make the negotiations harder. Um, layperson, well, non-lawyers and even lawyers who don't deal with negotiation clauses all the time immediately say, well, wait a minute, I'm not obliged to change my, let's say, ordinary commercial conduct in some mundane area. I don't know, land and property transactions. If I can do things to improve my house or to weaken your position so I'm in a better negotiating position. Yes, that's true. Where you have a situation where you've not pledged to negotiate, most of us, most of the time, are under no obligation to negotiate with anybody about anything. But it is possible in the international setting and even in ordinary commercial settings to pledge in a legally binding way to conduct negotiations. And China, among the other countries that are parties to the NPT, has made that sort of pledge. It's a pledge to negotiate. It's a de minimis pledge, and I don't want to exaggerate the scope of what you need to do in order to satisfy it. You need to come to the table and at least occasionally talk in good faith with an attempt to reach a solution on arms control and eventual disarmament. But you're also pledged to a certain degree of restraint away from the conference table. That certain degree of restraint doesn't mean you have to freeze your conduct. It doesn't mean you can never modernize. It doesn't mean you can never expand your numerical position. But what we've seen with China, and this gets to the Chinese buildup, and I think Chris Ford will say more about that, so I don't want to trespass onto his presentation. The buildup is really a big buildup, and we've been looking at this for some years now, and practically it seems like an annual ritual that we say, well, it was worse than we thought last year, and it's worse than we thought the year before. The numbers are really big. They're transformative if we believe even the modest projections. And it's that sort of transformative change away from the negotiating table that raises a really serious question about China's compliance with Article 6. Not to mention that they don't come to the table. That's a pretty bad starting point. We've offered in several formats to have negotiations that they've refused. That's unpromising, to say the least. But the further point that is often missed is that what China does outside the setting of a negotiation is really very, very hard to square with the good faith commitment that comes with a negotiations clause like Article 6.